Greetings, humans. It is I, Jamie Thomson. You may recognize me when I remove this mask. I've been involved in the VulcanVerse for a while now, writing the lore and the background to what's happening. I've been asked to answer 10 questions by Vulcan fans. I shall now reveal the true horror of my own face. Hold on, I'll just get my glasses. Greetings, humans. So, questions. This one comes from a guy called Nesswolf. Where do your ideas come from and what are your inspirations? Well, as a writer for many years now in fantasy and science fiction, having done many game books, such as, well, you can see there around the Fabled Lands there, and the Where the Tiger books, and there's a big map up there you can see of the can't do it with the Where the Tiger world and another fantasy world on my door. So the Dark Lord books. So I've been involved in fantasy, selling goblins to children, writing game books, computer games for years and years. And I started off, I guess, reading Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. So most of my inspiration comes from a self-feeding, where you read other fantasy tales, and then that feeds back into your own ideas, and they come out again in different ways, as well as mythology. So that's a very important part of any fantasy writer's research. There's endless mythology, from Japan to Greek mythology to tales of American Indians, and whatever it might be. And also I call upon the witches to provide me with inspiration. In this case, the black blood of children. All right, it's coffee anyway. So, another question. We're going to be doing some game books in the VulcanVerse. Another question is, how many books are there planned to be written? One single or a few more? Well, at the moment, it's going to be me and my ancient writing partner, the undead lord of the crypts, Dave Morris, who we wrote the Fabled Lands books together, plus a bunch of other stuff over the years. And we're planning at the moment probably 5. So it'll be 1 for each quadrant. It depends how they do it first, but definitely 2 to start with, which will probably be Hades and the Deserts of Notus. We're not quite sure yet. And if they do well enough, we'll do another 2, 1 for each quadrant, and finally something set in Vulcan City itself. Another interesting question here from a chap called Dahula, or a woman called Dahula, I don't know. How do you balance making demands on the reader with taking care of the reader? So if you're doing a novel, it's a very different experience in reading a novel than it is reading a game book. So game books, traditionally, in the past, we would make them quite harsh and brutal, and you would die pretty quickly and often, and that can be frustrating. But that was how things were done in those days. Even computer games back in those days were very roguelike in the 80s and 90s, but times have changed. So with the Fabled Lands, for instance, we wanted to introduce a system where you could buy resurrection deals. So if you died and you'd recorded a resurrection deal on your character sheet, you could be reborn. You might lose your equipment, but you won't lose your levels and all that kind of thing, because the Fabled Lands are a different kind of game book, very open world. So we'll do something similar with that. I don't think people really enjoy just being killed off at the drop of a hat these days, because you made the wrong choice in a game book. So we'll try and make it easier in that sense. If that's the thrust of your question. I mean, novels are different because you want to create sympathy for your characters. On the other hand, you may want to shock the reader, you may want to disgust them or horrify them. It's all very different. It also depends on the kind of reader you have. You don't want to trigger them. So it's a bit different nowadays than it used to be, but that's a difficult question to answer quickly. So, Sean, can you give us a brief overview of the story and how you see it adapting over the trilogy? I can't really at the moment. I've got one. Another idea is to do a novel set in the VulcanVerse, and I've sort of got a plot line for that, which involves a chap called Elon Musk, Mr. Husk, who's an evil entrepreneur and wealthy man who wishes to break into the VulcanVerse and enslave the sleeping gods of ancient Greece and use their powers to his own end, because you could imagine what a powerful man could do with Poseidon's earthquake powers. And Vulcan tries to, well, he's not really aware of it, the god himself. So that might be the kind of thrust of a plot line that we have, which sort of we might use for the game books. So there'll be a villain who may be trying to enslave the gods, and you have to prevent them. Although at this stage it's quite early days, so we may go in a completely different direction. And when Kaidik, I don't know how you pronounce that, Kaidik. When will the stories take place? Will they be tales of ancient history or be closer to present day? They will be present day. So it's like as if the VulcanVerse was real. I mean, not just virtual, but was a virtual world that you could really go into with. Well, you can sort of, like Ready Player One, that sort of thing. So it'll be modern, set now, and very contemporaneous with the VulcanVerse. And then the same guy or woman asks, what languages will the books be published in? At the moment, it'll be British. It looks like we're going to get Italian, but probably, hopefully, Italian, French, and German, because we've got these various game books in the past that we've. Here's the German Fabled Lands, and somewhere around here I've got a French Fabled Lands. Here we are. Over the Blood Dark Sea in French. So we've got these game book publishers in Europe that we have contacts with, and they, so far, well, we haven't approached them all fully, but at least one of them has expressed an interest, because game books seem to be coming back. And then we have Cursion, or Kirkion, or Circeon, perhaps. The question is, what is your process stroke inspiration for creating the world lore of a specific book project? How long does it normally take to research, brainstorm before writing anything? Well, it's lucky in a... There's an interesting point, because the Dark Lord books, which are children's comedy books, well, actually they work for 15, well, work for parents, so obvious works of great genius, for I wrote them. But they... the first book was about 40,000 words, and I had about 10,000 words of notes. I use that as an example because I had to create a sort of fantasy world from scratch. But we've been saved a lot of that research, which can take months, by because you have to create like the land, the map of the land, who lives there, what their motivations are, what kind of culture do they have, what languages and gods and customs and all the rest of it, geography and food. But because VulcanVerse is Greco-Roman, there's a lot of stuff that's already there. So it's just a question of adapting material. And being a fantasy writer myself, I'm already pretty au fait with Greek mythology anyway, because I read that for pleasure. So that was actually a lot easier this time. And it just became a question of how do you adapt ancient Greek mythology for a world like the VulcanVerse, which is a very modern virtual world. So which has been a lot of fun, and you'll discover more of that as you get into it. How much influence over gameplay will the books have, from a chap called the Glitched Viking? Interesting. All Vikings glitched in some way, perhaps. But could be a Viking woman now. Apologies if. So that's a very interesting question, because we're really tying the game books to the world. So what we want to do is have a place in the game book that you visit. For instance, the Fabled Lands, you have cities that are like paragraph numbers. You go back to those cities, and they change over time with tick boxes and code words that direct you into different paragraphs. Those au fait with game books will understand what I'm talking about more than those who don't. But we want to have content in the VulcanVerse which is game book enabled. That means you can play the game book normally on your own, or with dice, or well, we might not have dice. We haven't decided on that yet. But anyway, the point is, you can also then go to these places, some certain places in the game book, in the VulcanVerse virtual world, and take your avatar in there and find clues and material that help you in the game book, and vice versa. So there'll be very much a tie-in between the two. We're going to have lots of the same characters and items that you can find. Some of you may already have, like, I don't know, the Medusa of the House of Death, Hades card. That will appear as a character in in the game book. There will be Vulcanites that appear in the game books, which will be Vulcanites. And we might be able to arrange special Vulcanites that appear only in the game books and only in the VulcanVerse if you have a game book code to take there. So you might go to a place, and if it's game book enabled, you'll type in the code that you found in the game book, and that will release extra content for you. So that'll make the whole game book experience a bit different, hopefully. So that could be fun. And then Cercion again says, where is your favourite place to write? My favourite place to write would probably be in a Turkish kebab restaurant that also has plenty of wine, but I didn't get much work done. I'd just be stuffing kebabs and drinking wine. So I suppose I don't really have a favourite place to write. It's here. I write in this small cell, which I might pan around to show you. I find writing really hard work, so it's very satisfying when you get a book on a shelf, but it's hard. So it's not really fun in that sense. Drinking children's blood is fun, and harvesting it, obviously. But anyway. And another question: do you tend to have a structured writing process, or do ideas come at you at random, leading to stacks of notes and disjointed thoughts to be organised later? Another interesting question. So I'll use the Dark Lord as an example. There's a guy called Philip Ardar, who we've both won the Roald Dahl Funny Prize at various times. He writes kids' books. Some of you may know him or not. And we were discussing at a workshop on the Brighton Festival for writing children's books that he just has an idea and he just starts writing. And then after a time he has a book. As I said before, I had 40,000 words of the Dark Lord book finished, first one, but 10,000 words of notes. So I cannot start writing until I've already brainstormed, either with myself or well, that's another point really, but I can't start until I have the beginning, middle and end. That doesn't mean I'm going to stick to that beginning, middle and end, but I have to have a structure in place and I have to know how it's going to develop. And often I will work with Dave. We've got a little writers collective, so he'll want to write something, we'll bounce ideas off and brainstorm it, then he'll go away and write it. And we did the same with the Dark Lord books. We brainstormed ideas, so he helped me create the plot structure and the narrative structure. So I have that in place before I start. And it's the same thing with game books, although that's much looser. So you would basically have 3 or 4 routes through a game book plot, and you'll have all these different plot lines. Fablelands is another example of very snappy short plots. So you have loads and loads of plots or narrative events, each of which could be novels sometimes. Like you'll have civil war in book 1 of the Fabled Lands, and you can side on either side. But they're done very short and snappy. You might uncover a ghost at a farmhouse that's disguised. Someone disguised as a ghost as one of the plots, and they're ripping off the local people by scaring them. That could be a novel in itself, but we do that in maybe 20 paragraphs. So we have to have loads and loads of plot ideas, but we have big events. So for more of a linear game book, you'll have big events that happen. You know what will happen there and what must happen. But in between, you can do all sorts of different things, depending on the flavour. And it'll be a bit more open world. So the idea is that you'll be able to wander around the game book world of Hades, for instance, and that will be replicated in the VulcanVerse, and you'll have many adventures along the way. It could be a lot of fun. And then a final question is, what's your own personal relationship with Greek, Roman gods and mythology? They were the first thing I read. It's an interesting start for me as a kid in so many hundreds of years ago, before man was born. Alternatively, in the 60s, I suppose, and 70s. There wasn't that much fantasy. There was Lord of the Rings, and there was lots of sort of Conan and formative Michael Moorcock, but it wasn't everywhere like it is now. There were no films. There was the occasional Conan the Barbarian film, Star Wars, I suppose you could argue, was fantasy. But everyone's fantasy in those days was Greek myths, Greek and Roman myths, Egyptian myths, and Celtic mythology. But a lot of it Greek and Roman, because it was also taught in schools to a certain degree. And then I got a job early on in White Dwarf magazine for Games Workshop, and then Lord of the Rings came along, and fantasy became more and more about sub-Tolkien orcs and goblins and minotaurs. Well, it's a bad example. Ghouls and ogres and all that kind of thing. And the fantasy that we understand, that is prevalent everywhere today, of Warhammer and most fantasy games have these tropes. So it's like coming back full circle for me to the original mythology and going back to Greek and Roman. And it's happening elsewhere too. Some of you may know about the Hades computer game that's come out. So it's sort of a return to the roots in a way. And it makes it seem fresh and new. So we're talking about centaurs and hippogriffs and satyrs and the dark glowering skies of Hades and the lush farmlands of Arcadia where the dryads sing their songs. Wolves hunt and eat them. But that's now become fresh again, so it's great. I'm having a lot of fun doing that. So there we are. That's a bunch of questions. I don't suppose there's anything more to say on the matter. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's rather long and probably slightly insane, but then that's what you get. I'll say farewell with my Ninjato blade for the cutting of heads of those who disrespect or criticise my books in the wrong way.